Inverse and identity properties. An identity element combines with a real number without changing the real number. So the additive identity is 0 and the multiplicative identity is 1. What does this mean? Let's look at an example of the additive identity. 5 plus 0 equals 5. So when we added 0 to 5, we ended up with 5. So the 5 maintains its identity by adding 0. So 0 is called the additive identity element. Any number added to 0 is going to give you the same number. Let's look at an example of the multiplicative identity. What number do you think, when multiplied by a real number, will result in the same real number? Well, let's look at 5 times 1. 5 times 1 equals 5. So the 5 maintains its identity when multiplied by 1. So the multiplicative identity element is 1. Any real number when multiplied by 1 equals the same real number. Let's look at some examples. 6 times 1. We know that 6 times 1 equals 6. And this is an example of the multiplicative identity property. Remember, an identity property is an operation that when you apply that operation to any real number, the result is going to be the same real number. So the identity of the starting real number does not change. 0 plus 24 equals 24. We know that 0 is the additive identity element, so we are looking at the additive identity. 33 plus 0 equals 33. Again, this is another example of the additive identity. 1 times 4 equals 4. This is an example of the multiplicative identity. And we know that the identity element for multiplication is 1. So inverses are numbers that combine with given real numbers to result in an identity element. Well, what does that mean? Inverses are numbers that combine with given real numbers to result in an identity element. So let's remember the identity element for addition. The additive identity element is 0. So in order to get 0, we need to add a number's opposite. 5 plus negative 5 equals 0, which is the additive identity. So to get the additive identity 0, we add the inverse of the given number. So the identity element for multiplication is 1. So what can we multiply a number by to get a product of 1? Well, that's easy. We can multiply a number by its reciprocal. So if we have 1/2, then we can multiply 1/2 times its reciprocal of 2, and we end up getting the answer 1, which is the multiplicative identity. So if we multiply a given real number by its reciprocal, we'll get the multiplicative identity of 1. So you need to remember that reciprocal means the same thing as a multiplicative inverse. So 8 times 1/8 equals 1. 1/8 is the multiplicative inverse of 8, or the reciprocal of 8. 4/7 when multiplied by its reciprocal, or you can also call it multiplicative inverse, you're going to get 1. 2/3 times its multiplicative inverse or reciprocal, 3/2, is going to equal 1. So we need to think of a reciprocal as the multiplicative inverse. So think of inverse as meaning opposite. So an example of the multiplicative inverse of 6 is 1/6. Let's try to identify the following properties. We add 12 plus negative 12 plus 4. Then we go to the second line, and that simplifies to 0 plus 4. So what property did we use to go from line 1 to line 2? We can see that we added 12 plus negative 12. And we remember that 12 plus negative 12 is going to be the additive inverse property because we're adding 12 and its opposite. And when we add a number and its opposite, we end up with the additive identity element of 0. So in order to go from 12 plus negative 12 plus 4, we used the additive inverse property to get the additive identity element of 0. Let's look at another example. Let's say we have an expression that looks like 10 multiplied times 1/2 times 2. And then the next line is going to look like this, 10 times 1, and then your third line is simply going to simplify to 10. So what property did we use to go from line 1 to line 2? Well, we can see that we have multiplied 1/2 times its reciprocal or multiplicative inverse. And we know when we multiply a number by its reciprocal, we get the multiplicative identity of 1. So now we multiply 10 times 1 in the second line, and we can simplify that to 10. So let's summarize what we've learned. We've learned that we have identity properties, and identity properties are those that do not change a given real number. Identity property of addition is 0. 3 plus 0 equals 3. That is the additive identity. We also have a multiplicative identity. 3 times 1 equals 3. The multiplicative identity element is 1. We then learned about inverses. You can take a number and add its opposite to get the additive identity element of 0. Likewise, you can take a number and its reciprocal, multiply those two things together and get 1, which is the multiplicative inverse. Thanks for watching.